Good afternoon, everyone. How are we doing so far today? Amazing? Awesome, that's a great answer. So welcome to session 16, Rethinking the Church's Role in Child Welfare. If you've been to a breakout session today, hope you've been blessed. You'll already be aware that these sessions are on YouTube. So this session is being live streamed, so your image may or may not be on YouTube. And if you've missed anything that Jason says, or any of the breakout sessions, you can see them all on YouTube. Without further ado, I'm going to welcome up Jason.
Yeah, thank you. Well, my name is Jason Peters. I grew up in a very small town called Rosenort, Manitoba. I live there currently. Yeah, it's a great spot. We like to see it as the New Jerusalem, I think, is the way that we kind of view that place. But my story, like many of yours, starts with my parents. And so I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey, and then hopefully that'll help you tie that into this talk about rethinking the church and child welfare. So my mom was born in Mexico, and my dad was also born in Mexico. And I know that as soon as I came on stage, it happens everywhere I go, everyone goes, yeah, that kid's parents are for sure from Mexico. And so I get it. And from there, my dad's parents immigrated to Belize. And when he turned 18, he was working at a sawmill, and a board backfired and hit him in the head. And from that day on, till now, he's 68, he has had severe epilepsy. So as a kid, I grew up with a dad who had maybe 100 seizures a month, could have been more. It was pretty severe, and many of them were grand mal seizures, but that's sort of skipping ahead. My dad moved out of the old colony that he was living on, sort of migrated north up through the States. In the States, he met a pastor at a bar who shared the gospel with him, and that's when he became a Christian, and he continued to travel all the way to Leamington, Ontario. And that's where he met my mom, and they got married and had me. So I was the first kid that they had, the oldest. Favorite, best, all those things, still true to this day. They love me most. That's what I tell myself, because it's obviously not true. I was their worst child by far, not that any of you wanted to know any of that information. But they then moved to this little town in Rosenort. And there are some amazing things about small town living. One of them is that everyone knows everyone. And one of the terrible things about it is that everyone knows everybody's stuff all the time. And so everybody knew my family. And everyone knew that my dad had severe epilepsy and was very sick. Within a year, so when I was 3 is when we moved, and within a year of living there, he was no longer allowed to drive, which was good. He'd already rolled a few vehicles and crashed a couple times, so it probably should have happened earlier. And he was also not allowed to work. The thing with growing up on this colony in Belize was that it meant that he had very limited education. Grade 3, and I think if he's looking at, so my 4-year-old daughter just showed up, and quite honestly, like her preschool education, this is not to demean what's going on the Belizean colony, is quite a bit further along than what he would have been learning even in grade 3. But at that point in time, he had to quit school and work with his family and make money for the family. And my mom's story is not much different. Her mom passed away, and so she grew up in a home where her dad remarried. And then she moved from Mexico to Leamington. That's where they met, moved to Rosenort. And she also had a limited education. And it meant that when my dad lost his job, that we had to go on welfare. Now, I don't know if you've heard about Rosenort, but it's like super rich. And when I mean super rich, it's somewhere in like the top 10 wealthiest places in the country per capita. And there was really like one family on welfare, and I was the lucky kid. I was the one who got to grow up in that home. And so as I grew up, my dad's epilepsy got worse as he had to be on different medications and try new tests. His personality changed. This kind of kind, fun-loving person began having mood swings, and things were harder. But as I got older, by the time I was 10, 11, 12, I was starting to have to catch my dad as he was having seizures. And so there were many times where it was me and my siblings, and there I am trying to protect them. They're all younger than me, while managing my dad as he's having a grand mal seizure and trying to keep him from hitting his head and hurting his body as he is shaking on the ground. And this led to all sorts of issues in the home. One of them being, I began to think that I essentially was the person who should be in charge of everything. Because my dad, by the time I'm 12, my education was higher than him. I was the one who was caring for him. I was already driving the van. Those are things that you just do in a small town at 12. You just take it out for a drive. And there were all these things that I was doing. And I didn't realize the trauma and the stuff that I was actually taking on. And every Christmas, I'm very thankful for food hampers, but I wasn't growing up. Every year we got a food hamper. Almost all of our Christmas presents came from different people in the community. And so I actually grew up with this real frustration with God, with the church, with my family life, with all of the struggles. And I wanted nothing more than to leave Rosenort. Fast forward till about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when I first heard of an organization called Safe Families Canada. That's who I work for now, and this isn't going to be a lot about what they do today, but we, as an organization, focus on working with parents who are in crisis, whose kids are at risk of potentially being apprehended. We surround them with relational supports and care for the kids while Safe Families Canada staff work with the parents to help them get out of the crisis that they're in and thus avoid their children entering into the foster care system while their parents also begin to have these relational supports. And it wasn't until I started working for them and then moved back to Rosenort 3 years ago that I realized and saw a whole different side of this town that I had grown quite bitter to. Because it was when I started working for Safe Families that I heard, for the very first time ever, from multiple social workers who I would share this story with in front of parents in crisis to try and help them to just see that I could relate in some small way to what maybe they or their kids were going through, that social workers began telling me, if you'd grown up anywhere else, you would have grown up in foster care. And I had no idea. I had no idea that I had grown up in a town that essentially allowed me to stay with my family forever. Not only that, I have no memory ever of a social worker entering in our home and that ever even being a possibility. And that includes being a 12-year-old who has to care for my dad, care for siblings, but also being a family of 6 living in a 700-square-foot single-bedroom home where me and my sister are sleeping in a wet, unfinished basement, while my 2 twin brothers, the angels of the family, get to sleep upstairs in the warm, dry living room. Lucky kids. And so that was my story, but things that I never really appreciated, things that I was very frustrated with growing up, I've learned to be very thankful for. And they've helped shape my understanding of the way that we can truly surround families as the church to care for them and help them avoid entering into the foster care system. But not only just that, to allow parents to thrive as parents and for children to never have the fear of not living with their families. Because in this town, Rosenort is essentially a Christian town. There are 700 people, 700 churches. We are all just like super Christian. And so everyone goes to church, right? Like small town traffic jam, Sunday, 10 a.m. and 12 when everyone's going home promptly to have lunch together. And there was never a moment where my family did not have a vehicle. I think they went through like 5 minivans. Every one of them given by someone in the community. When one broke, the next one just came in and they started using it. At the co-op, you can charge your groceries. To this day, you can just show up and not pay and just say, put it on my account. So that's what my parents did, and at the end of every month, there were often months where they showed up and it was all paid for. And they didn't know how they were going to pay for it, but someone paid for it. So we always had a vehicle. We always had food. Every Christmas, there were the hampers, but then all of a sudden there were other gifts. People would show up and there'd be a brand new hockey jersey or brand new street hockey pads or all these different things. Myself and my 2 brothers, who were twins, all played hockey into elementary and high school. If you have kids in hockey, you know how crazy expensive it is. Imagine having twin boys in hockey. And we all played sports. Then everyone, the house that we lived in, made the local newspaper. So everyone realized this is a family of 6 living in a home that none of us would be willing to live in with our own families. So the 4 churches bought the house right next door, 5-bedroom, and set my parents up for a rent-to-own scenario, where to this day they are slowly paying it off and have the chance, if they want at some point, to own this house. That's crazy. And that's the group of people I didn't like for years. And I didn't realize all of the things that they had done for me. And very quickly, I could have become one of these statistics. So the Children's Aid Foundation, if we move on, estimates that every year there are approximately 300,000 children and youth that are at risk of abuse, neglect, or abandonment. So every year in this country, this isn't some other country, in Canada, 300,000 kids each year are at risk of abuse, neglect, or abandonment. And abuse and neglect are 2 of the mandates for when a child needs to be removed from a home. There are 59,000 young people across Canada currently in care, and that, I think, is quite a conservative number. There are thousands of youth who age out of care. We currently have a 17-year-old boy living in our home, and the plan was that they wanted to age him out last year. They wanted him living on his own this year, finishing grade 12. And he could no longer live at home because it wasn't a healthy environment for him or the family. And so it was either live on your own or he was going to have to end up in a shelter. And this is a kid from a small community who's never spent any time in the city, potentially being at risk of just being in a shelter because there was no one who would open up their home for him. In addition to these sorts of statistics, we also know that, again, a conservative number is that about 50% of people incarcerated have some experience with the child welfare system. That are members of our city and of our country who are living on the street, a large group, a large number of them, have some interaction with the child welfare system. This is not the child welfare system is bad. That is just what happens when children do not have the luxury and the right and the privilege to be able to grow up in their home, with at some moment they are removed from their parents. And the trauma that is produced from a child who endures being taken away from a parent, even if that parent cannot adequately support them, or even if there is abuse and neglect, the trauma of being removed from your parent is significant. And so this is not a conversation or a session on we need to be rid of CFS. It is rather a focus on what if we were focused on prevention? What if we spent our time and our effort as the church to care about kids, care for families, before they ever even got to that place? Is there a world in which we can live where something like child and family services is no longer needed? That's sort of the hope that I would want to bring, because statistics like this can be really discouraging. And I think some of what we need to do is we need to remember what it was. So Alvin Schmidt wrote a book called How Christianity Changed the World. And he focuses on all these key areas in which the early Christian community made an impact that essentially brought Christianity to the place where the Roman emperor would make it the public religion of the day. That they had such an influence in the good that they did that it just became the thing that made the most sense. And so, a few things. The church is what we need. So if the problem is that there's kids at risk of abuse and neglect, the church needs to begin to see itself once again as the group of people that want to step into that place. And why the church? Well, from our data with Safe Families Canada, there's a lot of reasons why a parent would be referred or call us for our services, but in every instance, isolation was mentioned as a reason for calling or a reason for needing referral. And I can't think of a better organization than the church to solve the problem of isolation. It is the thing that we are called to do. It is the thing that Jesus says is going to cause the world to know that we are disciples, is by our love for one another, our community with one another, our relationship with one another, the way we support one another, the way we wrap around one another, the way that we do not allow these differences to interfere with our commonality on Christ. That unity, that love is the thing that causes the world to know that what we believe is true. So we are perfectly positioned to be the group that says we can solve isolation. We were created for relationship, and we have been made by the one who we love because John says he first loved us. That we as Christians at times get caught with the same sort of ideology that the world has, that they should help themselves get out of the mess that they're in. Why don't they just go get jobs? Why don't they just go do this? Why don't they just do this? If they would just do this, then their life would be like ours. And Christians say the same thing, but I would just like to remind us that that was not what Jesus said to us. The message that we preach is actually the exact opposite of that. But we expect the world to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get out of their problem when we believe that actually the only reason we got out of our problem was because someone else pulled up the bootstraps. And so we need to remember that the gospel isn't just for us to be saved, but it is the way that we also ought to approach those around us, with a mentality that says, you will never be able to pull yourself up out of that. The message should not first be, go help yourselves and then we will help you. Or if you helped yourself the way I helped myself, then you would be in my position. No, that is not the gospel. The gospel is the opposite. I could not get myself out of the biggest problem, and Christ did not say, help yourself up out of it. He said, let me do it. And you receive it. So, we love him because he first loved us. But here's Fielding Garrison, historian. He says, before the birth of Christ, the spirit towards sickness and misfortune was not one of compassion, and the credit of ministering to human suffering on an extended scale belongs to Christianity. Those who were sick, those who were destitute, those who had no one were seen as less than. When I worked at Church of the Rock here for a number of years, part of the opportunities that I had was to lead a lot of the local mission trips. And this was something that we saw, especially when we went to Haiti and other countries, where those who were blind, those who were sick, were left alone to die. They no longer had value, and they consumed and couldn't give back, and so they were not seen as anyone to be cared for. And the only people who would go in were Christians, and this is exactly what the early Christians were known for. When the Roman population was quite literally leaving children in garbage dumps to die, when they were fleeing plagues, it was Christians who were going in and who were caring for disfigured and mangled children. It was Christians who were going in when there was a plague and there was sickness and being willing to take that on. And as the church, it's not to say that we all have to do that, but I'm going to be really honest and transparent. We fostered 2 teenage boys. I don't foster teenage boys because I'm just so excited for having teenage boys in our home. Right? If you have teenagers, especially boys, there's attitude there, there's smells there, there's just a bunch of stuff. But the reality is that if I know that the problem is there, I can't only ask God to solve the problem to other people. Sometimes we have to just step in and do things that maybe we don't always want to do. The call of the Christian life is not do whatever you want, when you want, and how you want, and when it's convenient. Sometimes it's we need to do something for the betterment of others. And that is why the Christian and the church is the answer to this, because we have at our foundation a Savior and a message that speaks to exactly this thing, that gives us the strength and the hope and the purpose to be willing to put others above ourselves. So, towards a preventative model, here is, I'm not going to read the poem because it's not going to be very elegant when I say it, but the gist of the story, the gist of the poem, and this is something at Safe Families that we use often when we talk about what we want to be. And this is what I would encourage us to think about when we think about what do we want to be as the church when we look at something like the children in our community who are at risk. And the poem essentially is about this cliff. And there are people that keep walking over the edge of the cliff and are hurt at the bottom. And the community comes together and they think, what can we do to solve this problem? And so there are some people who are like, let's build a fence so people stop walking over the edge. And others are like, we need an ambulance so that when they get to the bottom, there's someone to help them. And so the ambulance group wins out. And the problem is that they have no less people falling off the cliff. The same amount of people just keep walking to the edge and stumbling over, and more ambulances are needed, but the problem is never solved. And so we respond to the worst case scenario, we respond to the emergency, and eventually the group decides, no, what we need to do is we need to try and build a fence. Instead of focusing on the emergency once it's happened, what if we focused on preventing the emergency altogether? And so what they do, they build a fence, and there it is, problem solved. Super simple, no one walks over the cliff, ambulances aren't needed. And that is what I would say we are called to. And something that is worth putting our time and energy toward is saying, what is the fence that we can build that prevents children from being in environments where they are at risk? And so what we at Safe Families call it is our circle of support, but really it has nothing to do with Safe Families. Honestly, I dream of a world where I've talked myself out of this organization even needing to exist because it's something the church does. But very simply, imagine if the church said, the child welfare scenario is part of our mission. Families in crisis are part of our mission. And so, what if, as a small group in our church, we decided we're going to look to adopt one family a year? And as a small group or as a church, if we learn about a family in crisis, we are going to give them the same sort of support we would give one another in here. So I live in a town, again, where if you have a kid, it doesn't matter if it's your first or your eighth, You're getting meals for a month, right? Like there are so many ways the church comes together to support, and the world outside the church does not know this exists. They do not experience that sort of love and care in their life. So what if you heard about a family in crisis and you said, we're going to support a family in crisis for a year? Some of us in this small group or in this church are going to say, we're willing to have some kids stay in our home if a parent needs a break, right? Like if a parent just needs to go to Costco without 6 kids hanging on them, and they want to just be able to get their home in order, we can do that. Or if a parent needs to go in for a medical procedure, there's some people who can watch the kids while they do that. And what if some of you in that small group said, and we can mentor the mom or dad or both the parents, and we can help them figure some stuff out, connect them to appointments. And what if some of us drove them to and from doctor's appointments? And all of these things seem so small, but the reality is that every single one of those touch points helps a parent in crisis know that they are not alone. Know that they have someone to call on. Because that is what sets my story apart from everyone else's story. That when my dad was in the hospital for a month, I had a place to be. That there was never a moment where my parents thought we're alone and my kids have no safe place. And as the church, we can become that safe place. We can become the group of people that says, let's not respond when there's an emergency. Let's look and find those who are in crisis and say, how can we support you? How can we walk with you so that you're never even in a position where you ever knew that you would have had the chance of growing up in child welfare? Let me pray, and then we will end. Father, I thank you today. I thank you for all the missions and ministries here. And Lord, you have called all of us to different parts of the kingdom to serve in just amazing ways. And I pray, Lord, that for every one of these missions, you would help us to figure out where is our call, where do we fit in, and how do we use what you have given us to serve those around us. Lord, help us to be a community of believers who doesn't say, all these things are mine, but who says, these are all yours. How do we use them to serve your world? In Jesus' name, amen.
All right, thank you so much, Jason. Yes, that's... as Jason and I were talking before the session, this is just such a huge ministry, mission field, whatever you want to call it. We're surrounded, especially in this day and age, there just seems to be more and more broken families, broken homes. Thanks for the encouragement. Thanks for the challenge, Jason. Jason's going to be hanging out, so if you have some questions or like to ask him some more opportunities with that organization, that would be great. So just to let you know, the next session will be starting at 5:30, and it is Good News at Your Doorstep. And then I would ask that you all exit through the far right door, as Mini Mission Fest is going on that side. And yeah, thanks again for joining us. I hope that you were blessed and encouraged by the message from Jason, and have a great rest of the weekend. Thank you. Okay, we're testing 1, 2. Probably don't need this. Testing. There we go. Okay, so we are just before the finish line for breakout sessions anyway, not for Mission Fest. My name is Eric Lawson, and I am your host for this session, number 18, which is titled Good News at Your Doorstep. And we'll be hearing from Shane and Alana Powell. Excited to hear what you guys are all up to. If you've been to a breakout session, you'll know that these are being live streamed. So your image may be on the video, and you can check YouTube for any of the breakout sessions if you've missed anything. So without further ado, Shane and Alana, please come up.
Excellent, thank you. As he mentioned, I am Shane, and this is Alana. We're part of a move-in team in Surrey, British Columbia, and we just wanted to share some of our experience and what it's been like for us. So welcome to Good News at Your Doorstep. Today we'll be unpacking how an ordinary place, the community you call home, can become the threshold of extraordinary change. Together we'll dive into stories, unpack strategies, and brainstorm how you can engage with your neighbors. Along the way, we'll discuss some biblical examples of how others stepped into their communities with intention, compassion, and authenticity.
Hopefully, you leave inspired and equipped to share good news from your doorstep. A lot of our inspiration, as Shane already mentioned, comes from our association with MoveIn. Our vision is to see groups of regular Christians prayerfully moving in among the unreached urban poor globally. Through MoveIn, we've discovered that the gospel comes alive in the most unexpected places.
For us, that's been high-density communities, where every knock on a neighbor's door can be seen as an opportunity to share love, hope, or the good news. What if you don't have to go far to see something extravagant happen? It can start right where you already are, your apartment hallway, a local park, or maybe the coffee shop down the road.
We've been living as a family intentionally and building relationships in a patch, which is an under-resourced community in Surrey, BC, for almost 10 years. For the first 8, we were in Whalley, which was in North Surrey, and it's the lower income neighborhood where there's more crime and more homelessness, but also a relatively cheap haven for newly arrived refugees and other families to start their Canadian lives. And as a family, we outgrew that home.
Yeah, we have 3 little children and another on the way, so our apartment got too small.
And the Lord led us to a larger apartment in another diverse community where we could continue to reach out to the unreached urban poor. Still in Surrey, but just a little bit south from where we were. So we'll draw a number of examples from our personal experiences.
Mm-hmm. I'm also a member of MoveIn's communications team, which means I get to collect stories from MoveIners all around the world. So we'll dive a little bit into that too. I look forward to the opportunity to share some of these stories. Due to the nature of these relationships, we'll change some of the details and we'll try to keep it more private, but we're looking forward to it. But first, we wanted to share the verse that MoveIn draws its name and inspiration from, and that is John 1:14. In the message, it reads, "The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, that one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish." So this is what we're striving to do. We move into a community and communicate Christ in the neighborhood. Now, it is important to note that our goal isn't to improve a community, but rather to see the opportunities that Jesus already has in the community when we interact with our neighbors.
Yeah, a lot of the relationships that we have, we've gained just as much from as they have.
Yeah, and we'd encourage anybody who is getting engaged in their community just to look for the relationships over agendas. So for Alana and I, our move-in journey started quite uniquely. A lot of times people hear about neighbors who've decided to move in or friends, and they decide, I'm going to join that team. For us, we had a shared passion when we got married to be involved in cross-cultural ministry, and we really thought that was going to be overseas. To the point where about a year after we got married, we packed up our stuff, we quit our jobs, and we did a vision trip overseas with Christar to pick which field we would go to.
Yeah, imagine our surprise after connecting with teams in 3 different countries, talking to the missionaries there, as well as the home office staff. We all agreed that God wasn't actually calling us overseas, but that He wanted us to be involved in cross-cultural ministry here in Canada. The same mission staff who were supposed to help us choose an overseas field helped us reevaluate our purpose and pointed us towards MoveIn.
That's what it took for us to see that God was calling us to our local doorstep. We never regretted it. What started out as, okay, we'll try this for 3 years and see how it goes, has now almost been 10 years.
I challenge you to ask, am I intentional about where I'm choosing to live? If you are, that's great. Hopefully some of these stories will be inspiring for you in your own context. If not, maybe this weekend can help you decide where God wants you to be. Let's dive deeper into authentic engagement. How are you being intentional about your presence in the community? It's about building relationships, fostering connections in everyday spaces. It might mean spending a nice weekend at home in the community park, even though most of us have the means to be able to travel other places.
When I think about our doorstep, I think of the acronym OWL. You know, like the little bird that sits on a branch staring down at you with its beady little eyes. So O, W, and L. Step out, and then welcoming in, and then being willing to look around. So first of all, let's look at stepping out. In MoveIn, we emphasize urban settings, such as apartment buildings or other environments where we know we'll be in regular contact with our neighbors. This setting creates more organic opportunities to step out and be a part of our community. For instance, some of Alana's best conversations happened in our previous building in the laundry room that was shared in our complex. When you're waiting for your laundry to finish, you have lots of opportunities to wait for others who are doing the same.
I remember one conversation I had with a young Indian man who was a neighbor of ours. And while we were waiting for laundry, he shared some about his family back in India, how they were farmers, how the current politics were affecting them. There was a farmers' strike at the time, and he was quite worried about them. And it was an opportunity to gain a better understanding of where he came from and the things that were important to him.
If you live in a house or a more closed living environment, there's still plenty of opportunities involved in stepping out into your community. Sometimes it just means getting creative.
For example, after reading an article that small restaurants in our community were struggling, our team decided to try a different local restaurant each week for a month to support the local businesses and to get to know some of the owners. We tried to go to the small mom and pop shops or the ethnic restaurants, and it was a good way to get to know the different cultures in the neighborhood and support the businesses. One of my favorites was an African restaurant that we went to. I don't know if you've ever tried fufu. It was a bit more fermented than I was used to, but the jerk chicken was really good. And the owner was a woman from her country in Africa, and she was very proud that she was hers was one of the first woman-owned restaurants in the city. And she was excited that we had come and that we wanted to hear her story, and she offered each of us a dessert to try on the way out the door because she was excited by us being there. And some of our teammates were able to ask about opportunities to pray for her.
Yeah. As Alana mentioned earlier, we're now in a newer community, and we found in this community there's a lot more children, but there's no central play area that's nice and safe. So we decided we'd make our front yard that safe space. And this is also part of being willing to step out, finding the needs in your community and asking God how you can meet them. So for us, we put a big chest full of toys on our front porch. And that just drew people in. It gave them opportunities to use what was there. And all through the summer, and the summer before that we've lived there, our yard just transforms into a common space where parents know it's safe, their kids can hang out there, whether our kids are outside or not. We have kids in our front yard a lot of the time. This has been unique in that, alongside opportunities to meet the children and their parents, it allows us to also emulate proper parenting skills to the children who are there. I know one time, Alana was having to mentor our older son, who was 4 at the time, about parroting some of the words he'd heard the older kids use in our complex that were not appropriate. So she was having a conversation saying how, look, we don't use the Lord's name inappropriately. Later on that same day, I heard one of the Muslim girls who had been playing in our yard sharing the exact same words as she reprimanded her teenage sister and informed her that she was not using appropriate language and they had to honor God's name. So it was a reminder to us that when we're stepping out and living in community, people are listening and they're paying attention even when we don't know it. Next is welcoming in.
The beautiful symbolism of our doorstep is that it's where we can invite people into our lives. Jesus uses this illustration in John 10:9 when he says, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture." As we emulate him, sometimes we need to welcome people in as well. Sometimes I can find this intimidating because my home is where people find out who I really am, and I'm not a great housekeeper. But I do find that when I open up my home and invite people in, it's a level of authenticity that resonates with people, and it creates unique discipleship opportunities.
One of these discipleship opportunities happened right before a $1 a day event, which is an event that MoveIn was hosting for a while, where people were encouraged to reduce the money they spent on food to $1 a day for a week, and then the money that we saved, we would give to different ministries that could use those funds. So in this case, we had planned well. We had a pile of food on our freezer that still wasn't big, but we decided to have a celebration meal before we started. And we invited one of our neighbors, who is a new believer, in to enjoy that meal with us. She was a welfare recipient and didn't have that much herself, but when she looked at her pile of food, she commented on how she even usually had more food than we did. So we explained how we were doing this so that we would spend less money and we were going to be giving this money away. We told her we were going to be making bannock and pierogies and doing a few other things to reduce costs, and she looked really thoughtful and reminisced about how her family growing up, they were pretty poor and they also used to make pierogies. It was quite inspiring the next week when she came back to us with a big smile on her face and said she'd been thinking about what we were doing, and she herself had made enough pierogies to tide her over for 3 days, and then with the money that she saved from that, she made her first contribution to the church she's attending. And it was wonderful to hear how welcoming into our home at that exact time turned into a discipleship opportunity for her.
Yeah, sometimes welcoming in can also create an invasion into your space. When we first started out, some of our teammates were having kids over for an after-school homework club, and they realized that they were getting lice. Some of these kids had brought lice with them, and it would have been easy for them to shut the door or to decide, well, let's not be in our apartment, let's go and do this outside. But instead, they went to the parents and asked if they could set up an inspection station and regularly treat those who had the little critters. Word got out, and soon other parents were also sending their kids over to have inspections and treatments done. Mm-hmm. And they had numerous opportunities to share Bible stories and tell these little girls about Jesus as they were combing out their hair and just picking out nits. Mm-hmm. How can you turn an invasion into a gospel opportunity?
Yeah. Another of our teams was on the East Coast, and they experienced a multi-day blizzard. During this blizzard, they quickly found out that many of their neighbors who were newly arrived immigrants were not equipped for the power outage that came with it. So the team invited them back to their place. They had camp stoves, and they were able to use these to heat water for soup and for hot drinks. They said it was an amazing opportunity just to create authentic relationship, and by welcoming them in, those relationships lasted longer than the storm did. I have one more story about welcoming in, and it's a bit of a reversal. It's from one of our international teams, a Muslim background believer who had moved back into the slum where she grew up. While she was there was a huge fire, and it burned down almost every house in their slum. She was given many opportunities to move out of that slum and live with other Christians. They all welcomed her to move out, but she decided rather than do that, she was going to live in one of the emergency shelters with the other people in her community. And so now welcoming meant moving over and letting somebody sit on the cot beside her that she was sharing with her neighbors. Or it meant sharing some of the raw rice that they had to eat, because the city had given them food rations, but they hadn't provided them power or fuel to cook it. She said this was a very hard season for her, but she was also joyful because it gave her more opportunities to share the gospel than she ever experienced anywhere else.
The last letter that we will talk about is L, which is for looking around.
This is an extension of the previous two in some ways, as we really should be looking around while we're doing both of them. But it's also a bit of a mindset. It's asking what's going on and how can I be involved in what God's doing? So let's examine it a bit more. There's a lot of good meat in Jeremiah 29, but we'll just focus on verse 7 for now. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. So how do we seek out the welfare of a city? This is where prayer comes in. We prayerfully look around the community and we become a part of it. So I'm going to break this down into two parts again: intentionality and interruptions.
Looking around means sometimes you need to plan ahead, and that's where intentionality comes into play.
Remember that chest of toys and sports equipment that I mentioned? It actually turned into a bit of an issue. We found some of the items were being damaged and stolen, as the kids in our area didn't have a lot of experience with being able to use other people's things. For example, we started out with 6 badminton rackets, which quickly dwindled down to 0 badminton rackets. We bought 4 more badminton rackets and put them in on a week that we were going to be away, a weekend, and the 3 days later that we got back, those 4 were gone as well. So at that point, we realized we might need to change things. We also had a neighbor upstairs that worked night shifts, and she was finding it quite disturbing as children were in our front yard from noon, often till sundown, whether our family was home or not. So now, to address it, we've started locking that chest, and that's our form of intentionality in interacting. This creates more designated playtimes where we can say, you can have the keys or we can go out with them, which in turn creates more opportunities for us to interact directly with them. We're also hoping to have specific times where we bring out specific games and teach the kids how to play them this summer, and possibly run a VBS-style program. All of these, we hope, will create more opportunities to share a positive experience and the good news with them.
And sometimes planning intentionally means being creative and looking for new opportunities. In previous years, I've tried to piggyback on our church's ladies' Christmas tea. I'll buy a table full of tickets and invite neighbors to come and join me. And it's been a success. We've had lots of different people from different backgrounds come and join us, but this past year we were out of town during the tea, and we missed the chance. But we didn't have the capacity to host a large outreach on our own. So Shane happened to find a Christmas tree by the dumpster that was still in good condition, and we set it up on our front porch. We decorated it with envelopes that had the names of all the children that we knew in the community, with a little coupon inside that said, "Come to our door and get a bag of popcorn. Merry Christmas from us." And it ended up working better than we expected. By the time we took the tree down, all of the envelopes had been claimed and every family had come and had a quick conversation with us. I had the opportunity to share with a few families what we believed about Christmas, and even found out that one of our new neighbors had named their son after John the Baptist because it had taken them 15 years to have kids, and he really liked the story of Zechariah the priest. He's a Muslim, and so his version of the story is a little bit different, but he's interested in talking about the Bible story at some point, and we're hoping that leads to more opportunities for conversation with him in the future.
Being intentional can also be where training and gaining experience come into play. This is not an area of Move-In's expertise. Rather, our teams rely on local connections or partnerships for the training they need for their own contexts. But there are a lot of other organizations here at Mission Fest who have great training and resources. So I suggest you take some time to think about what you're wanting to be intentional in and take a look around, because there's lots out there. And if you're looking for something specific, we know a lot of the other organizations and would be willing to point you in a specific direction if you talk to us.
Yeah, and you might also recognize me from the Christar booth. We're doing double duty this weekend. If you're interested in learning about any specific world religions, we have some booklets at the table, as well as resources are available online to learn about what people believe, as well as how it compares with what Christians believe and what the Bible says. So if you're interested in that resource, you can come by my booth. As well, there's some online training that is happening over the next few months, also to learn about different religions and how to reach out to those people. So I can get you that information as well.
Other times, seeking the welfare in your community means being open to interruptions. Much like the parable of the Good Samaritan that Jesus used to answer the question, "Who's my neighbor?" we need to be the ones who are open to opportunities that mess up our previous plans. One example of this was shared to me by one of our teams in Germany. So the gentleman was saying on his way to work, he overheard a senior neighbor just mentioning in her doorway that it was her birthday. She also mentioned that coming from a poor family, nobody had ever baked her a cake, a senior who had never had a cake in her life. He mentioned this to his team as he was headed out the door, and one of their newer members jumped on the opportunity, and she's like, I'll bake a cake. And so that's what she did. She, the newest person in the building, baked a cake immediately. She then boldly went up to this lady's door, knocked on it, and invited herself in to share it with the neighbor, which kind of astounded her. The best part of this story is that this new teammate had just arrived from Latin America, and she did not speak German. So this was all with sign language. This spontaneous act of kindness made her very popular in the building, and as her German developed, it opened up a lot of opportunities for her to share the gospel.
One vivid memory that I have is a Sunday evening when I was taking out the garbage and ran into one of our neighbors. We chatted several times. She had a few kids, and we talked about motherhood. This time she looked pretty overwhelmed, and she told me that her family had just been evicted, that the help that they had planned on to help them move wasn't showing up, and they didn't even have bags to pack their stuff in. And so I offered to run back to the apartment and get a box of garbage bags. And Shane was quick to jump on the opportunity to help as well, and with supper in the crock pot, we had all evening to help them out, and so we helped them load up their garbage bags into their van, and at the end of the time with them, I knew that the wife was a Christian, but we were surprised and encouraged that both the husband and the wife joined us in prayer for them before they moved on to their new community. And this is one of those interruptions that transformed a normal evening into something that ended up being really special.
Mm-hmm. I've always enjoyed that interaction. I think one of the parts that I really enjoyed was that two of the Syrian boys who had recently arrived in our complex, they saw me grabbing the bags and bringing them out, and they immediately jumped at the chance, and they just started coming and moving things. They didn't speak English, so they just laughed and were happy and helped me move bags out to the vehicle. And I'm pretty sure their dad put them up to it, but it was exciting to have their cooperation in getting the work done. Another example of an interruption came not from looking, but just from being willing to step out of our comfort zone. Not all of our neighbors were easy to live alongside. After sitting empty for more than a year, the apartment below us was suddenly and very loudly occupied by someone who had a habit of coming home in the early morning and blaring their stereo system so loud that we actually had things fall off our walls. They were also quite rude and belligerent to everyone on the floor, and generally fairly hard to live with. This and other behaviors eventually got this lady evicted from our building. She did not comply that willingly, and a team had to be sent in to remove her belongings, and they just piled them on the front lawn in front of her house. And as often happens in Surrey, it happened to rain that night, and we could tell she was very distraught. So we had some tarps with our camping equipment. Alana decided she would go down and help her cover things up. The lady was so grateful. She was willing to share a bit of her story, and we found out that she had been incarcerated for a large number of years and had gone through a season of forced rehabilitation and then reintegration into society sooner than she had felt she was ready. But by Alana being willing to just go down and share her faith with her, she was receptive in that moment, and they had a good time together, but she didn't want to continue the relationship. So we don't know what happens next in her story, but we would like to think that that brief interaction had an impact on her, and we do pray that she meets more believers in the future.
Yeah, both of those last two examples are extreme examples. It's definitely not something that we encounter every day or every week. This was over the course of 8 years living in that apartment. Of course, since then, there have been other interruptions, just usually more low-key, like baking a recipe and then realizing, oh, I don't have any eggs, and knocking on a neighbor's door instead of choosing to go to the store for those ingredients. Or getting up at midnight for the fire alarm, which did happen often enough for it to be low-key.
Mm-hmm. Little interruptions continue. Just a couple of weeks ago, a youth in our complex found a phone on the ground, and they passed it along to me as they thought, hey, you can maybe find the owner. So I brought it home. It was dead and it needed a charge, and soon after the owner called. And as randomly as it seemed, it happened to belong to somebody that we knew a little bit. She came through our complex quite often, collecting bottles and cans, and we had a casual relationship as she really liked our children, and she'd stop and say hi to them and then ask if we had anything that she could take. And she was very grateful that somebody she knew had come and was willing to help her. So this interruption did change our routine a bit, but it was worth it for the small encouragement to them.
So I would encourage you to be open to interruptions. When you look at what's happening around you, are you willing to change your current schedule to accommodate what God is already doing?
As we draw to a close, I have 2 more things I want to highlight. And the first answers the question, where do we start? The answer to this is always prayer. In Move-In, we have a prayer-first focus. Every team is completely unique in how they choose to impact their community and the relationships they build, but they all commit to praying once a week. And this is something that all of us can do no matter where we are. It's wonderful if you can find people in your family or a group of friends, maybe somebody from your church that you can be praying with, but block out that time weekly to be praying for your community. Because when we start with intentionality, opportunities follow. The second is keeping your relationship with Christ strong. It's important to step out, welcome in, and look around with intentionality in that room to have interruptions. But remember that we as believers, our lives are built on personal relationship with Christ first. So we need to prioritize that time.
Yeah, building boundaries can be hard. But one of our Move-Iners, who's a registered therapist and also a mother, shared this helpful tip that she's found useful when interacting in her community. Whenever she tells someone no to something, she tries to explain to them what she's doing instead. So she might say, "I'm sorry I can't spend time with you today. I'm taking my daughter to a soccer game." Or, "I'm sorry I can't welcome you in right now. I'm helping another neighbor with their refugee papers." It's a way to let people know that you're not just turning them down or turning them away, but that you're choosing to be intentional in the time that you have. And also, if you're willing and able to set up a time in the future to also hang out with them, that's another way to build a boundary.
Yeah. As we come to the end of our time, you've now heard a handful of stories from Move-Iners. We've enjoyed talking about them. I'd like to know, just what stood out to you the most. And as you think about that, just think about how it can be applied in your own lives, something similar. Because it's great to be inspired, but it is good to take it to the next step and decide how we're going to act on it. So once you've thought of something, I'd challenge you to just talk to somebody close to you that can hold you accountable. And if you're not sure where to start, then I'd say start with prayer. That is always the best place to start and to end as well. So we'll say thank you for joining us. And if you have more questions about Move-In, you can find me at the booth. You can also talk to Alana. She's willing to answer questions about Move-In as well.
All right, thanks so much. I just love how, you're preparing to go to the nations, and then the nations are coming to you now. So you're still working with the nations, but in a different capacity. I love how the Lord just orchestrates that. So, so that concludes the breakout sessions for Mission Fest. Stick around for, I think the next main session starts at 7. There's Kids Mini Fest going on, and the booths are still open. So thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and thanks to Shane and Alana for sharing. And have a great rest of the weekend.